The land stretched wide beneath a sky so bright it seemed endless, the horizon drawn in a line of heat where earth and heaven kissed without ever truly meeting. The air smelled of dust and dry grass, the sort of air that clung to the throat and carried the sound of a crow's wing farther than one would think possible. Out there stood a ranch, lonesome and worn, its fences leaning slightly as though they too were tired of holding back the weight of emptiness. The windmill turned with a lazy creak, and a man moved beneath it with deliberate steps, his hands coarse from years of work, his shoulders drawn like a man accustomed to silence more than speech. That man was Evan, 33 years of age, and though he had all the breadth of a plainsman and the strength of one accustomed to shaping his own survival, there was something in his eyes that spoke not of pride but of solitude, of a heart that had long ago resigned itself to its own company. Each morning he rose before the sun, listening to the coyotes fade into the distance, and each evening he walked the pastures as the sky bled red with the setting sun. His life was ordered in work, repairing fences, hauling water, tending to cattle. But beneath that rhythm beat a dull ache, one that came not from the body but from the absence of another voice beside him. He did not speak of it, never confessed to anyone, but the truth was simple. Loneliness was a companion he had never chosen yet had somehow grown used to. In town, they whispered about him. Some said he was too quiet, too proud, that no woman would dare tie herself to a man who barely looked away. Others hinted that perhaps his blood carried bad luck, since those who came close never lingered. But Evan did not answer their talk, nor did he correct them. He lived apart, kept his words inside, and when the nights grew long, he sat by the fire and stared at the wooden ring that had once belonged to his mother, kept as though waiting for a day he never believed would come. That day began in heat. The sun had already climbed high when Evan noticed a plume of dust rising in the distance. He shaded his eyes with his hand, suspicion pricking him. Few travelers came this way without reason, and those who did often brought more trouble than ease. Slowly, from the wavering horizon, shapes emerged, a tired horse pulling a battered wagon, its wheels squealing under the strain, and seated within it a woman with 2 children pressed close against her. They moved like souls chased from something, driven not by desire but by necessity. Evan's jaw tightened as he leaned on the fence rail, waiting as they drew near. When at last the wagon pulled into the yard, the horse stumbled, ribs showing through its hide, and the woman who reined it in sat stiffly, her dress torn near the hem, her face marked by fading bruises that told a story no words were needed to explain. She could not have been older than 28, yet hardship had written lines upon her brow, though it had not stolen her dignity. Beside her clung a boy of about 6, his eyes wide and wary, his hand wrapped protectively around the little girl, who could be no more than 4. They looked to him as though he were the last barrier between them and a world that had shown only cruelty. The woman cleared her throat before speaking, her voice hesitant, roughened by dust and weariness. "We don't mean to trouble you," she said, lowering her gaze as though ashamed even of the request. "But if there's a place we might rest a night, we'll move on at dawn." Evan's silence stretched. He studied them, not with suspicion, but with the weight of a man cautious of giving more than he could afford. Yet something in the way the boy's fingers clutched the girl's dress, or the way the woman sat upright despite her fatigue, spoke to him. Finally he nodded, his voice steady but low. "Stay. You and the young ones. There's room enough." Her shoulders eased only slightly, as though kindness was something she had learned to expect sparingly. She introduced herself as Eliana. The boy was Ian, the little one Mila. They dismounted slowly, and the children stood close to her skirt while she thanked him with words that carried both gratitude and shame. He offered no questions, only pointed her to the house. From that day forward, life within Evan's ranch shifted. It was not dramatic, not sudden, but gradual, like a trickle of water carving stone. Eliana moved about the kitchen, insisting on cooking meals though she had been offered rest, and she mended small tears in his shirts when she thought he would not notice. Ian followed Evan as he worked, carrying small tools, eager to be of use. Mila, with hair that caught the sunlight, laughed in bursts that startled the silence of the house until it no longer felt strange but welcome. Yet beyond those walls, the world was not kind. Word spread in town that Evan had taken in a widow. The whispers sharpened into cruelty. His desperate, Tarkeen and another man's beaten wife. One voice muttered at the store where Evan came for supplies. Others smirked, casting glances at him as though he had bartered his pride for companionship. Evan ignored them outwardly, but inside he felt the old battle between shame and defiance rise. He feared for Eliana's dignity, feared that the same whispers reached her ears. And indeed they did. In the general store, Eliana overheard two women with baskets in their arms muttering loud enough for her to hear. "She'll ruin him," one said. "Mark my words. A woman like that brings nothing but disgrace." Eliana stood still, her face pale, but her hands clutched a basket so tight her knuckles blanched. When she returned to the ranch that evening, her steps were heavier. Evan noticed, but she offered no explanation. Still, connection grew between them, not by declarations but by gestures. Evan rose early one morning to find the wagon wheel fixed. Eliana had worked through the evening to make it serviceable. He, in turn, set about repairing a hinge on her trunk that had long been broken. Ian carved a crooked wooden horse and shyly placed it on Evan's chair. Mila wove wildflowers into a small braid and left it where he would sit. Each act was quiet, yet each whispered of belonging. One evening, as the firelight glowed against the walls, Evan spoke softly. "You work too much." Eliana looked at her hands, raw from scrubbing. "I'd rather my hands ache than feel useless." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that her presence had filled the silence he had carried for years, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he only nodded, letting silence speak what he could not. The world, however, was not content to let them be. A man from Eliana's past rode into town, speaking words poisoned with contempt. "She ran, but she's no saint," he sneered. "That widow'll bring shame to any man fool enough to keep her." The whispers spread faster, sharper, until they reached Eliana's ears once more. The next morning, before the sun had risen high, Evan found her at the wagon, quietly loading what little they had. Ian's eyes were wide, Mila clutched a rag doll. Eliana's face was set with resolve, though sorrow flickered beneath it. "I won't have my children grow with people spitting on their names," she said, her voice breaking but steady. Evan's chest tightened. "Let them spit," he answered, his voice rough. "A man's life ain't theirs to measure." But she shook her head, tears catching the corners of her lashes. "You've given enough. I won't cost you more." And so she left, wagon creaking as it rolled away. Evan watched until the dust swallowed them, the emptiness around him heavier than it had ever been. The house felt like a tomb without them. The silence, once familiar, now gnawed at him. He sat at the table, staring at the chair where Mila had left her flowers, and something inside him broke open. Loneliness, he realized, had never been safe. It had only been waiting for someone to show him what he was missing. And now that he had seen, he could not bear to return to emptiness. By noon he saddled his horse, resolve burning where silence once dwelled. The trail was clear, wagon tracks pressed deep into the earth. He followed, dust rising behind him like smoke. He found them near a shallow ravine where the wagon had sunk into soft earth, the horse straining uselessly. Ian tugged at the reins, Mila cried softly, and Eliana stood beside them, her hands pressed to her face. When she saw him ride up, her shoulders stiffened. "Go back," she said before he had even dismounted. "This ain't your burden." Evan stepped down, dust swirling about his boots. He did not argue with force, did not raise his voice. Instead, he walked to her, slow and certain, until he stood close enough that the weight of his words could not be mistaken. "Eliana," he said, his voice trembling though firm, "I don't care what they say. You've mended this place, mended me. I can't go back to emptiness. Not without you." She shook her head, tears spilling. "And if shame follows?" "Then let it follow," he whispered. "Let the world burn its words. I choose you." From his pocket he drew the small silver band, worn smooth by years of waiting. He knelt, not as a man rescuing another, but as one stripped bare, offering all he had. "Will you stay?" he asked, not as a guest, but as mine. For a long moment, silence hung heavier than stone. The children watched, their young faces reflecting hope and fear alike. Eliana's hands trembled, her breath shuddered, and at last she nodded, whispering through her tears, "Yes." Relief surged through him, not like thunder but like rain on parched earth. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking, and when their eyes met, it was as though the horizon had drawn near at last. Together, they freed the wagon, and together they turned it back toward the ranch, dust trailing behind like a banner of triumph. At the homestead, life resumed, but it was no longer the same. Ian laughed as he raced the horses, Mila sang to the chickens, and Eliana hung laundry beneath a bright sky. Evan stood at the doorway, hat in hand, watching with a wonder that softened his rough edges. The gossip in town did not cease, but it no longer mattered. His house was no longer empty. His life was no longer hollow. And to those who might listen, an old voice would say, "Perhaps we all walk through deserts of silence, carrying shame not our own. But sometimes grace arrives with tired hands and children's laughter. Sometimes love does not roar, it lingers at the table, fixes what is broken, and waits for courage to speak. If you find it, do not let it pass you by. The world will always talk, but only your heart knows where home is." Before you ride off, tell me where in the wide world you're watching from.